In World War II, over 1 million African American men and women put on the uniform, ready to fight for a country that didn't always fight for them. They stormed beaches, loaded ammunition, flew missions, and drove supply convoys into the heart of danger. But behind the medals and victories was a darker reality. Segregated barracks, unequal pay, and constant humiliation. This isn't the story you learned in school. This is the truth about the black soldiers of World War II and the battles they fought both overseas and at home. When World War II broke out, African Americans faced a choice that was as personal as it was patriotic. Many were sons and grandsons of men who had fought in World War I, only to return home to Jim Crow segregation and second-class citizenship. They knew the country did not see them as equals, but they also knew the stakes. Nazi ideology openly preached racial supremacy, and many black men felt a personal conviction to prove that democracy's promise was worth fighting for. Recruitment centers in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York saw long lines of young black men eager to enlist, while in the rural South, men signed up despite knowing they'd have to fight a war on two fronts, one abroad and one at home. Yet from the moment they stepped into basic training, they encountered a reality that contradicted everything the war was supposed to be about. The military was segregated by law and tradition. Black soldiers slept in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and were often trained with outdated or broken equipment. In some camps, they were forbidden from using certain facilities if white soldiers were present. And yet, the Army still needed them. The Selective Service drafted African Americans in huge numbers, eventually swelling their ranks to over 1 million, more than at any point in U.S. history. Even with systemic barriers, hope burned bright. Many believed that wearing the uniform, fighting bravely, and shedding blood for the United States would force the nation to see them as equals. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph pushed for the WWII campaign, victory over fascism abroad, and victory over racism at home. For these young soldiers, the battlefield was not just Europe or the Pacific. It was also the soul of America itself. Life in a segregated army meant constant reminders that African Americans were not considered equals. The U.S. Army assigned most black soldiers to service and labor battalions, unloading ships, building airfields, and driving supply trucks, while white troops were sent to combat roles. This wasn't because black soldiers were less capable. It was because of a deeply ingrained belief within the military hierarchy that they couldn't handle the stress of battle or the complexity of leadership. At bases across the country, segregation was enforced with an iron fist. In some Southern training camps, African American soldiers had to sit at the back of military buses or were barred from certain streets in nearby towns. In one shocking incident in Louisiana, black soldiers who tried to use a whites-only movie theater were beaten and arrested. Meanwhile, German POWs held in U.S. camps often received better treatment, allowed to eat in restaurants and shop in stores that refused service to black servicemen. But despite the indignities, there were cracks in the system. Units like the 99th Pursuit Squadron, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, began to prove that African American soldiers could excel in the most demanding combat roles. Their outstanding performance in protecting bomber formations from enemy fighters directly challenged the racist myths that had kept black troops out of the skies. The bravery of these pilots began to inspire change, but slowly, far too slowly, for the men still forced into backbreaking labor far from the front lines. Even in non-combat roles, black soldiers faced danger daily. Truck drivers in the Red Ball Express risked enemy ambushes and air attacks while hauling vital supplies to advancing Allied forces. Engineers building bridges in active war zones were shelled by enemy artillery. They bled and died for the same cause, but rarely received the same recognition. When African American soldiers shipped out to Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, many found a strange and painful irony. In some places overseas, particularly in France and Britain, they were treated better by local civilians than they had ever been by their fellow Americans. French villagers welcomed them into homes, offering food, wine, and warmth. Things they had never been offered in segregated towns back home. In Britain, black soldiers often formed friendships and even romances with locals, something that infuriated white American officers, who sometimes went as far as enforcing Jim Crow rules on foreign soil. In combat zones, the reality was stark. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only African American infantry division to fight in the European theater, endured some of the fiercest fighting in Italy. Facing entrenched German forces in mountainous terrain, they suffered heavy casualties, but also earned multiple Distinguished Service Crosses and Silver Stars. In the Pacific, African American Marines of the 51st Defense Battalion defended island outposts against Japanese attacks, often under relentless shelling and with limited supplies. But even as they fought fascism abroad, racial injustice followed them. White officers sometimes downplayed their achievements or rewrote after-action reports to credit white units for victories. Medals were denied or delayed for years. In some cases, black soldiers who saved lives under fire returned home to face lynch mobs. Yet these men held on to the belief that their service meant something. For many, writing letters home about their experiences was a way to preserve the truth, that they had fought, bled, and died for a freedom that America had yet to fully grant them. They knew history might forget them, but they refused to let their story go untold. When the war finally ended in 1945, many African American soldiers believed their service had earned them a new place in American society. They had endured the horrors of war, risked their lives under enemy fire, and proven themselves in every theater of battle. They returned home wearing their uniforms proudly, expecting at least a measure of respect. But for most, the welcome they received was a crushing reminder that the war for equality was far from over. In the Jim Crow South, black veterans were often warned not to wear their uniforms in public. White supremacists saw them as a threat, men who had been trained, disciplined, and emboldened by military service. In some towns, police and white mobs targeted returning soldiers for acting above their station. Newspapers documented beatings and even lynchings of decorated veterans. One case that shocked the nation was that of Isaac Woodard, a black sergeant who was beaten and blinded by police in South Carolina just hours after being honorably discharged. Even outside the South, discrimination remained entrenched. Veterans applied for jobs they were qualified for, sometimes overqualified for, only to be told that colored men need not apply. The GI Bill, which provided education and housing benefits to millions of veterans, was administered locally, allowing racist officials and banks to deny black veterans college admissions, home loans, and business financing. The bitterest irony was that many of these men had fought alongside white soldiers overseas, shared foxholes, and saved lives, only to return to a country that refused to share basic rights with them. For some, the disillusionment was overwhelming. Yet others refused to be silenced, carrying their wartime determination into a new fight, the Civil Rights Movement. The story of African American soldiers in World War II is filled with names that should be household legends, but aren't. Men like Vernon Baker, who single-handedly destroyed multiple German machine gun nests in Italy, leading to the capture of a heavily fortified position. Despite his heroism, it took the U.S. Army more than 50 years to award him the Medal of Honor, making him one of only 7 African Americans to receive it for World War II service, all awarded decades late. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was equally extraordinary. Escorting bombers over Europe, they racked up one of the lowest loss rates in the Army Air Forces. Yet for years, their contributions were downplayed or outright ignored in official histories. Similarly, the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, fought in the Battle of the Bulge and liberated towns across France and Belgium. General Patton himself praised them, but back home, their story barely made the papers. Even beyond combat units, African American contributions were vital. The men of the Red Ball Express kept Allied forces supplied as they advanced across Europe. Often driving day and night under fire, they moved thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food, without which the front lines would have stalled. In the Pacific, Black Seabee units built airstrips and fortifications in sweltering, disease-ridden conditions, enabling island-hopping campaigns to succeed. These men were heroes in every sense of the word. But the racial politics of the time meant their stories were buried, their achievements credited to others, or their heroism dismissed as an anomaly. It would take decades and the voices of surviving veterans to bring these stories into the light. While the war did not end racism in America, it planted the seeds for change. For many African American veterans, military service was the first time they had traveled beyond their home states, interacted with people from around the world, and been exposed to the idea that racial hierarchy was not universal. Seeing how people in Europe, especially in France and Britain, treated them with more dignity than their own country did was eye-opening. This contrast fueled a determination to challenge the status quo. Black veterans became some of the most outspoken voices for civil rights in the years after the war. The WWII campaign they had embraced during the conflict, Victory Abroad, Victory at Home, became a rallying cry. Leaders like Medgar Evers, who served in France, and Hosea Williams, who was wounded in battle, carried their military discipline into organizing protests, voter registration drives, and desegregation campaigns. Even within the armed forces, the cracks in segregation began to show. The exemplary performance of black units during the war provided undeniable evidence that segregation was not only unjust, but also a waste of talent. This momentum eventually led President Harry Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the U.S. military. The service and sacrifice of African American soldiers in World War II became one of the moral cornerstones of the civil rights movement. Their fight had begun in the trenches and cockpits of a global war, but it would continue on the streets of Montgomery, Selma, and Washington, D.C. The war had changed them, and in time, they would help change the nation. The toll of war for African American soldiers was not measured solely in medals, casualty lists, or official records. It was measured in the psychological scars, the frustration of returning to a segregated homeland, and the crushing realization that their sacrifices had not dismantled the system they fought to defend. Many veterans carried the weight of unacknowledged service for the rest of their lives. In battle, these men endured some of the harshest conditions, not just from the enemy, but from within their own ranks. Some black soldiers were assigned to the most dangerous labor duties without proper equipment, forced to unload ammunition under enemy fire while their white counterparts rested. In the Pacific, malaria, dysentery, and tropical heat killed and incapacitated thousands. And while all soldiers faced the risk of death, black units often had to fight two battles, one against the Axis and one against the prejudice of their own commanders. When the war was over, the struggle didn't end. Many veterans found themselves ineligible for the same medical care or pensions given to white soldiers. The Veterans Administration, influenced by segregationist politics, made it harder for Black veterans to prove service-related disabilities. For those suffering from PTSD, a condition barely understood at the time, there was almost no support. And yet, they endured. Many buried their anger and pain in order to provide for their families, silently carrying memories of nights on the front lines, of friends lost in moments of chaos, and of the cold, bitter irony of defending a country that denied them full citizenship. The cost of their service was not just their youth or health. It was the hope that the war would bring a lasting change that, for many, never came in their lifetime. By the 1960s and 1970s, some veterans began to speak out, breaking decades of silence about their experiences. Oral histories and memoirs revealed the personal side of a story long buried by official narratives. In interviews, men like Leon Bass, a Black soldier who witnessed the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp, recalled the shock of seeing unspeakable cruelty in Nazi camps, only to return home to segregation. "I was fighting for freedom, but I didn't have it myself," Bass said. Others described the surreal dissonance between their treatment abroad and at home. In Paris, they were invited into cafes, treated as equals, and even celebrated. But back in the United States, white-only signs and voter suppression laws reminded them that the freedom they fought for had clear limits. This painful contrast pushed many veterans to join, fund, or quietly support the civil rights struggle. Historians began to uncover just how much of World War II's success depended on these troops. Without the Red Ball Express, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761 St. Tank Battalion, and the thousands of segregated engineers, cooks, medics, and drivers, the Allied war effort would have been crippled. Yet, in films, books, and popular history lessons, their stories were often erased or reduced to footnotes. The veterans who spoke out wanted future generations to know the truth, not for recognition alone, but so that the injustice they faced would never be repeated. Their voices challenged the myth that the good war was fought equally for all Americans, revealing a more complicated, more human truth about sacrifice, dignity, and the fight for respect. Today, the legacy of African American soldiers in World War II is finally gaining the recognition it always deserved, but it remains a legacy built on both pride and pain. Monuments now honor the Tuskegee Airmen, and museums tell the story of the 761 St. Tank Battalion. The U.S. military is integrated, in large part because their service proved beyond doubt that skill and courage know no color. Yet, the lessons of their experience remain relevant. The war showed that America could rise to face an external enemy. But the internal battles over equality were far harder to win. For younger generations, the story of these soldiers is more than history. It's a reminder of how fragile progress can be, and how easily sacrifice can be forgotten. Family members of veterans still share stories passed down through decades. Tales of cold nights in foxholes, of the sound of artillery fire in the distance, of the laughter shared between men who knew that at any moment it could be their last. These stories are personal treasures, but they are also national history, pieces of a truth that too many tried to bury. By remembering their service, we honor more than their wartime bravery. We honor their endurance in the face of systemic injustice, their refusal to be broken by hate, and their determination to demand the freedom they were promised. Their fight did not end with the war, and in many ways, it continues today.